All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely deconstruct a massive assumption about the world we live in today. When you look at a globe, what do you see? You see a world entirely carved up into neatly drawn, rigidly bordered nation states. And honestly, we treat these lines like they're as natural as mountains or rivers, right? Like they've just always been there. It feels permanent. It feels like the natural evolution of human society. But today, we are going to absolutely shatter that illusion. We're going to look at how the modern territorial state was violently engineered using the fascinating and tragic history of 19th century Ceylon, what we now know as Sri Lanka, as our lens.
We have a really profound historical journey ahead of us. Here is our agenda for today. 1. The modern state myth. 2. Ceylon's galactic sovereignty. 3. The 1815 ontological collision. 4. The violence of improvement. And 5. Erasing the pluriverse. We're going to start with some abstract concepts of political ontology, and then move straight into the brutal reality of 19th century colonial Ceylon.
So I really want you to hold this question in your mind as we go through this. Is the modern nation-state natural? Because we live in a world of tightly enclosed territorial boxes, where a central government claims absolute authority over every square inch of land within its borders. But this system, it's not the default setting for humanity. Not at all. It's a highly specific European invention that was violently exported globally. And to understand how that happened, we really have to understand what was destroyed to make room for it. Which brings us to a foundational concept. To truly grasp what colonialism destroyed, we first need to understand the pluriverse. The pluriverse is the undeniable fact that entirely different realities, cosmologies, and ways of organizing human life can, and historically did, coexist. It's the exact opposite of a single universal system forcing everyone to live and think identically. The pluriverse actually allows for different worlds to share the exact same physical geography. Okay, moving to section 1, the modern state myth, and how borders were built. Let's see where the state actually comes from. We're constantly taught to assume that modern states are timeless, natural containers for societies. But European total territorial rule, this idea where power stops in a hard, definitive line at a border, was an entirely specific regional concept. It wasn't universal. Historians often call the century between 1815 and 1914 in Europe a time of great peace. But as research from Dr. Ajay Parasram shows, that European peace was bought and paid for by externalizing immense violence onto the colonies. The British masked this violent expansion of territorial rule behind the noble-sounding rhetoric of a civilizing mission. Section 2, Ceylon's galactic sovereignty, known as the Rajamandala system. Because if Ceylon wasn't operating as a rigid nation-state before the British arrived, how exactly did they organize their society? Think about the contrast here. On one hand, you have European territorial rule, rigid boxes, absolute private property, centralized bureaucracy, and a strict separation of church and state. But in Buddhist South Asia, they used the Rajamandala, or galactic sovereignty system. Borders were not hard lines, they pulsated and shifted. Material power was heavily decentralized. And crucially, the political realm and the cosmological, spiritual realms were entirely united. They weren't separate at all. This concept completely blew my mind when I first read it. Instead of a bordered map, imagine a solar system. It's literally the perfect way to visualize the Rajamandala system. The king's authority wasn't a bureaucratic iron fist, it was a gravitational pull. He sat at the center, maintaining cosmological and material balance, while diverse, highly autonomous communities and provinces orbited him like planets. The further out you went, the less gravitational pull the king had, and the more autonomy those local provinces enjoyed. It was a delicate, beautifully decentralized balance of power. Let's jump into Section 3, the 1815 ontological collision and the Candian Convention. Because the crucial question is, what happens when two entirely different realities violently crash into one another? We can track the methodical erasure of indigenous sovereignty in Ceylon right here. The British initially just took the coastal maritime provinces back in 1796. But the massive turning point, the real collision, happens in 1815 with the Candian Convention, where the British take control of the interior Candian kingdom. This escalates through the devastating economic reforms of 1833 and ultimately ends in absolute bloody suppression with the Matale Rebellion in 1848. Dr. Parasram makes a really profound observation about this. The 1815 Candian Convention wasn't just a standard political treaty where one side wins and the other loses. It was a massive, fundamental misunderstanding. When the British signed it, they believed they were legally acquiring total, absolute real estate, just adding a new territorial box to their empire. But the Canadians, they experienced something completely different. See, the Canadians were actually operating on their own galactic logic. For centuries, when foreign rulers entered the Canadian system, they were accommodated and integrated through a process of Buddhification. They were brought into the local cosmological order to protect the Buddhist faith. And the Canadians expected the British to do the exact same thing, particularly to protect the sacred tooth relic. But the British, operating from a rigid Christian universalist worldview, totally failed to grasp this. They viewed their promises purely instrumentally. It was just a temporary tool to pacify a population they deemed backward, all while Christian evangelism was actively working to overwrite local indigenous cosmology entirely. Section 4. The Violence of Improvement and Overwriting the Landscape. Once the British realized the Canadians weren't going to simply submit to becoming a European-style territory, they totally changed tactics. The 1833 Colebrook-Cameron reforms were absolutely devastating to the pluriverse. Just look at this transition. The British took Raja Korea, which was an ancient communal duty to perform local public works, and twisted it into a brutal forced labor system to build infrastructure for British military and coffee plantations. They took communal forests and subsistence farms and used Crown Lands Enclosure Acts to literally steal them outright for absolute private property. And finally, they took 16 decentralized, pulsating indigenous provinces, completely erased them, and standardized them into 5 centralized districts controlled entirely from the capital. This was the transition to what they called liberal colonialism. The British didn't call this subjugation. They called it improvement. They weaponized that exact word to justify stripping away ancient communal land rights, paving over indigenous geographies with massive commercial coffee plantations, and violently enforcing a brand new capitalist reality onto a population that had operated without wage labor or absolute private property for centuries. Which brings us to Section 5, Erasing the Pluriverse, the climax and the legacy of this explainer. Because when you attempt to violently overwrite a people's reality, their land, and their cosmology, resistance is totally inevitable. By 1848, ordinary Canadians had absolutely had enough. The Matali Rebellion exploded as locals aggressively resisted massive new taxation and this alien concept of total territorial rule. And the British response? It was horrifying. They dropped the whole facade of benevolent improvement and violently crushed the resistance using brutal scorched earth tactics. We're talking burning villages, destroying irrigation, declaring extreme martial law. This was the exact moment the modern territorial state was permanently forcibly normalized in Ceylon. Indigenous ways of life and spatial practices were treated like pencil marks on a piece of paper, just completely erased so a brand new map could be drawn right over them. I want to pause here for a second. This incredibly deep analysis comes from Dr. Ajay Parasram's thesis, and he actually includes this beautiful dedication to his late friend and colleague, Matt Nelson. He notes they spent their time invested in the 19th century with our feet grounded in the 21st, and that is so vital to remember. The violence of 19th century state building isn't just some dusty, abstract history. It is the literal foundation of the geopolitics, the border conflicts, and the ethnic tensions we are dealing with right now, today, in the 21st century. Which leaves us with this one crucial takeaway. If the territorial nation-state is not a natural human evolution, but rather a highly specific colonial construct built entirely on the violent erasure of the pluriverse, are we still living inside the very cage they built? When post-colonial nations fight to maintain absolute borders today, are they truly free, or are they just operating the colonial machinery left behind? I really want you to think about that the next time you look at a map of the world.